The 1930s is considered the early age of sound films and the golden age of the movie monsters as Universal Pictures began production on what would become some of the most iconic horror films. These adaptations of popular novels became famous worldwide and still serve as the template for horror monster icons for future generations. The 1990s was the decade where a Japanese company named Capcom started a worldwide phenomenon with the arcade game Street Fighter II. The game was originally produced by a team in Japan, and as its popularity grew across the United States, they began to receive feedback from the company's foreign branches. At the time, the US branch of Capcom would support the team in Japan by localizing their games, making licensing agreements with other companies, and providing information regarding players' tastes and trends occurring in the West. The American team was partially responsible for Street Fighter II's further revisions and iterations such as Champion Edition, which increased the playable roster, and Hyper Fighting, which adjusted the speed and served as a counter-reaction to the rise of the pirated versions of the game. Up to this point, Street Fighter II was running on Capcom's CPS arcade board, but for its next iteration, Super Street Fighter II, the game would be running on its successor, the CPS-2, which allowed for more sophisticated graphics and audio. As a token of gratitude for his contributions to Street Fighter II, James Goddard was offered the opportunity to develop an original character for the game, which led to the creation of DJ, a character inspired by Billy Blanks from his movie King of the Kickboxers.
I will send you to hell to join your brother. I've been there for 10 years!
By its fourth arcade iteration, there had been more companies with a number of fighting games in the market, so Capcom chose to develop new and original fighting games alongside Street Fighter. According to Akira Yasuda, the art director who worked on Street Fighter II, ideas for these new fighting games originated from his fellow colleague Akitomo. Akitomo was already a big X-Men fan who would personally translate all of the Marvel X-Men comics before they were officially translated in Japan and share them with everyone in the office to read. Eventually, the development team also became X-Men fans, including their boss Yoshiki Okamoto, who wanted Capcom to get the rights to X-Men so they could design their own video games. Akitomo also brought up the idea for a monster fighting game, which was given form by fellow designer Junichi Ono, who previously worked on the beat-em-up Captain Commando. Capcom Japan reached out to their American branch to expand this new concept for a monster fighting game. The offer came to Alex Jimenez, another designer at Capcom USA. Alex was a big fan of the Universal monster movies from the 1930s and proposed a fighting game concept based around famous monsters battling each other, a common scenario seen in the original films. The team in Japan agreed to the concept, but instead of having to deal with Universal Pictures and acquiring the rights to their famous monsters, they decided to create their own cast of original characters with the input received from the American branch. Following their work on Street Fighter II, Noritaka Funamizu and Yoshiki Okamoto were placed in charge as the producers for this new fighting game. Akira Yasuda assembled a team of developers within Capcom who were previously working on a side-scroller and a game based around a manga before they were cancelled. Normally, each designer was assigned a character or group of characters for which they would create a personality and story. The original concept for this new game was basically Street Fighter with the human characters being replaced by monster archetypes. To help further differentiate the game's premise from Street Fighter, Funamizu brought into the team Haruo Murata, a design planner who joined Capcom in 1990 and had worked on a number of the company's other arcade fighting games. His responsibility was to add personalities to these otherwise stereotypical characters and bring all of these separately designed elements into one cohesive universe. When Murata first joined the team, the character visuals had minimal variations. No one ever really grew curious about the characters beyond what they saw on the screen. So, Murata started adding individuality, memorable traits, and more unique concepts to the characters that were being cranked out by the designers. The overseas staff assisted in evolving the game's story by suggesting names for the characters and particular relationships between them to give the players a further sense of their distinctive backgrounds. These little ideas would serve as seeds that later blossomed into new concepts as development continued. It was a conscious decision within the development team to make the art of this new game different from the art of Street Fighter. Since this was Capcom's first attempt at cartoon-style sprites, the designers used the animations of Tom and Jerry and Hanna-Barbera as a reference, and the vibrant colors inherent with Disney as an influence. Akira Yasuda was impressed by the work of a relatively new artist at Capcom, so he appointed him as the main illustrator of the game because he wanted to push his talents to the forefront as much as possible. This illustrator did a lot of work under a number of pen names like Gouda Cheese and CRMK, but those who would become familiar with his art style at Capcom primarily knew him as Bangus. The music would be composed by Takayuki Iwai and Hideki Okugawa, with the main plan being to create a score that suited each character's vibe and reflected their personalities. This fighting game would be called Vampire: The Night Warriors in Japan, but when it was released overseas, the game was changed to Darkstalkers: The Night Warriors. The premise for Darkstalkers took place on an alternate Earth in the process of merging with the Demon Realm, bringing about the arrival of the game's main characters. Players had the option of 10 different characters based on mythological figures and horror staples from different regions of the world. The roster included Dimitri, a vampire noble from Romania who served as the game's main protagonist, Morrigan, a powerful succubus from Scotland with a carefree attitude, John Talbane, known as Galen in Japan, a werewolf from England skilled in martial arts, Anakaris, a resurrected Egyptian pharaoh, Felicia, a catwoman who aspires to become a star, Victor, a monster from Germany created by a mad scientist similar to Frankenstein, Bishamon, a Japanese samurai possessed by a cursed suit of sentient armor, Lord Raptor, known as Zabel in Japan, a former rock star from Australia turned zombie, Rikuo, known as Albeth in Japan, a merman from Brazil believed to be the last of his kind, and Sasquatch, a yeti from Canada that belongs to a tribe of Bigfoot people. When players defeated all 10 characters, they would face 2 boss characters, Huitzel, known as Phobos in Japan, an ancient robot from Mexico designed to destroy any powerful lifeforms, and Pyron, a shape-shifting alien from the planet Hellstorm. Darkstalkers was one of the first fighting games released on Capcom's new CPS2 hardware, and the new engine's improvements were seen instantly by players in its rapid combat and expressive characters. Since the roster was based on monster archetypes instead of martial artists, like most fighting games at the time, it gave the developers more creative freedom when it came to the character animations and world designs. While the cast played a lot like the ones found in Street Fighter, they became unique not just in their personalities but in each of their underlying mechanics. For instance, Darkstalkers started with the foundations previously established by Street Fighter II, but also added its own unique features like air blocking and dashing. There was an option to choose between 3 different speed levels which increased character movement, but its most original feature was the chain combo system, which made it easier for players to create combos out of a character's attacks and gave the game a much faster pace than Street Fighter II. If certain characters were blocking an opponent's attacks, players could perform a reversal attack known as the guard cancel, which could quickly turn the odds in their favor. Players had a special meter which would fill as the player dealt attacks or took damage. When full, the special meter would power up a player's special moves or grant them access to a rare super move. However, as soon as the special meter was filled, it immediately starts to empty, thus limiting the time the player had to make use of it. Players who became aware of Darkstalkers found the character designs and different playstyle very appealing. Capcom decided to continue iterating on the game, as the fighting game genre was still considered a highly lucrative market for the company. The next Darkstalkers game was released 1 year later in 1995, entitled Vampire Hunter Darkstalkers Revenge, which was changed to Night Warriors outside Japan. While the game was touted as a sequel, it was actually more of a revision of the original Darkstalkers, featuring a variety of new content and refined gameplay mechanics. The original characters received more color variations and special moves, as well as more options when it came to performing chain combos, easily doubling the amount of moves a player could perform. The speed options were reduced to just normal and turbo, and there was a new auto guard option where players could now have the first 10 hits received automatically blocked as long as the blocking player didn't press any buttons. However, choosing the auto guard option came at the cost of limited chain combos and the loss of manual chain combos. Characters could now perform air throws and tech hits which allowed them to escape from a throw. If players were knocked down from an attack, they were now able to roll away, but the player who performed the knockdown was also able to perform a pursuit attack right after the knockdown. The special meter was charged to hold up 9 stocks and would carry over to the following round. Special moves and pursuit attacks could also be powered up with a stock of meter by performing them with 2 attack buttons instead of 1 during its execution. The game's roster now had 14 playable characters, including the 2 original boss characters and 2 new characters who served as counterparts to the monsters of the first game and to whom the game's title refers to. Donovan Bane, a half-human, half-vampire demon hunter who is accompanied by a girl named Anita, and Shenko, known as Lele in Japan, a Chinese vampire who's also a demon hunter along with her twin sister. While Night Warriors was more of a superior iteration on Darkstalkers, their premise for the game was slightly altered. In the first game, Dimitri was responsible for organizing a tournament to decide the ruler of the so-called Demon World, the Lord of the Night. But in Night Warriors, it is said that Pyron seeks to destroy the planet, which leads to Darkstalkers becoming the last defenders of mankind. Regardless of the game's altered premise, Night Warriors was a much better fighting game than its predecessor. The additions and refinements introduced in Night Warriors allowed the Darkstalkers series to become more than just a spin-off fighting game from Capcom, but one that could easily hold its own against its contemporaries. Beyond the continually impressive artwork and character designs, the iterations to the game's mechanics resulted in a more enjoyable fighting system. For their next iteration of Darkstalkers, Capcom chose to wait 2 more years before releasing another game in the series, and it would prove to be more ambitious than anything fans had seen before. With the Darkstalkers Revenge, players were introduced to hunters that pursued the characters in the original Darkstalkers. So for the next game, the team believed a fresh avenue they could explore was an entirely new enemy that could overshadow all of the other conflicts within the Darkstalkers universe, shifting the player's perception completely. At the time, creating a game straight from a concept was rarely done. Games are usually built from the foundation of the system, then characters, and so forth. But the next Darkstalkers game would be unique in that the team made character selections and designed sequences based entirely on this new concept. They also felt like they had already represented most of the well-known monster archetypes, so instead of forcing themselves into picking an esoteric monster to add, they decided to create a character that meshed well with the established Darkstalkers flavor. In 1997, Capcom released Vampire Savior, the Lord of the Vampire. New mechanics were introduced that allowed for more player options and changed the overall pace of the game. The most immediate instance of this was seen in how Vampire Savior changed the flow of rounds between matches. Life bars for players were now based around a stock system instead of the more traditional round system. Known as the damage gauge system, when players depleted their life bar, their characters would enter a down state at the cost of a marker shaped like a bat, and the match would resume immediately afterwards. Once a player loses all of their stocks of life bars, the match would end. The life bars also had a new feature related to a received attack's damage. When a player receives damage, the depleted stock would be shown by a transparent white bar that could potentially be replenished over time if the player stops receiving damage. This increased the risk involved with waiting for the opponent to make a move during the fight because both players were incentivized to keep attacking each other without stopping, and the one who kept moving had a better chance of winning. Possibilities for chain combos were extended and could now be performed in the air, known as aerial chains. Each of the returning characters had some of their special moves changed when it came to their button executions, but one change for each character that was universal was their guard cancel move. There was a new tech hit option known as the advancing guard. When a player presses buttons while blocking, the player could push away their opponent performing any series of blocked hits, with the strength of the last blocked hit button determining how far away the opponent is pushed back. Special meters can now hold up to 99 stocks during a match and could be used to perform a new move called Dark Force. At the cost of 1 stock of special meter, the player who activates Dark Force gains a new special ability, different for each character, for a limited amount of time. These Dark Force abilities ranged from new special moves or new tools that granted new combo possibilities. However, when a player's Dark Force time was depleted, the activating player would automatically enter a cooldown animation, which could potentially leave them open to an attack by the opponent. Pyron, Huitzel, and Donovan were removed from the roster in Vampire Savior, but in their place were 4 new characters, making for a combined playable roster of 15. BB Hood, known as Boletta in Japan, a human demon hunter with the twisted soul of a Darkstalker. QB, a humanoid insect from the demon world. Lilith, a young succubus who originates from Morrigan. And Jeddah, a resurrected demon lord who seeks to recreate the world through his own methods and serves as the new antagonist. Players also had access to Shadow, a secret character that made the player's character take on the role of the last defeated opponent. With its combination of new and old mechanics, Vampire Savior elevated Darkstalkers even further among other fighting games, and is generally considered by players as the definitive game in the series. Due to the game offering players additional speed settings, the majority of players opted to play on the fastest speed setting. As a result, Vampire Savior matches progressed much more quickly than those of Night Warriors. Players were often forced to make split-second decisions throughout a match, with the unfortunate downside of this being that Vampire Savior normally required a certain amount of skill before one could have a fair chance against most players. While the changes in Night Warriors widened the player base considerably, it's possible that the changes in Vampire Savior counteracted that somewhat. Instead of having fans wait for years before hearing about another update to Vampire Savior, Capcom decided to release 2 updates to the game just a few months after its arcade release, in the form of Vampire Hunter 2 and Vampire Savior 2. These 2 updates reused many of the mechanics and assets introduced in Vampire Savior, while also removing mechanics and changing characters' special moves yet again. Initially, it was believed that Pyron, Huitzel, and Donovan were not featured in Vampire Savior for canonical reasons, but the reality was that their addition would expand the game's roster to a point that would have a detrimental effect on the arcade hardware's limitations, resulting in a less than desirable performance. So, Vampire Hunter 2 was designed to bring back the same cast and soundtrack from Vampire Hunter, with some of the changes introduced in Vampire Savior. Meanwhile, Vampire Savior 2 still added Donovan, Pyron, and Huitzel to the roster, while removing John Talbane, Rigro, and Sasquatch. Both updates were featured alongside each other in arcades and considered equally popular among fans, but since these arcade updates were never released outside Japan, their popularity saw a faster decline and are now generally ignored. These 2 revisions of Vampire Savior would later be compiled together with all the characters into Vampire Savior EX in Japan, which was released as Darkstalkers 3 on home consoles. When the Sega Dreamcast was released and enabled new features like online console multiplayer, Capcom began releasing versions of their popular arcade games that took advantage of this functionality. Darkstalkers received this upgrade in the form of Vampire Chronicle for matching service, which was released in the year 2000. Vampire Chronicle allowed players to mix and match different parts of the Darkstalkers series, letting them play a character based on each iteration of the game that's been released, and using any of the rules that pertained to a certain installment. Unfortunately, these online-enabled Dreamcast games from Capcom never saw release outside Japan, but this version of Darkstalkers would eventually be ported to the PlayStation Portable, where it had features and modes unique to the platform. In 2005, another Darkstalkers compilation was released by Capcom in the form of Vampire Darkstalkers Collection for the PlayStation 2. This compilation featured all 5 arcade releases from Darkstalkers along with new bonus content and various Easter eggs from the prior console versions. The most notable addition to this game was the new character named D, who was a combination of Dimitri and Donovan, but again, like Vampire Chronicle on the Dreamcast before it, this compilation was never released outside Japan. When Darkstalkers came to the arcades in the 90s, it presented an opportunity for players to become engaged in a new fighting game from Capcom, as well as a new universe of characters that came with it. As was the case with many video games that received adaptations during this time period, these outsourced endeavors tended to come with mixed results.
Of course!
In 1995, a Darkstalkers cartoon was produced by Graz Entertainment, one of the production companies that also worked on the American Street Fighter TV series. The series lasted for 13 episodes and was loosely based on the fighting game at best, focusing on a young boy named Harry and changing the roles of the original Darkstalkers cast. The show's skew toward a young audience along with its poor quality writing and animation resulted in a complete lack of appeal to Darkstalkers fans or anyone with good taste, hence its short run on television. In 1997, a 4-episode anime series was produced by Madhouse Studios and featured characters designed by Shuko Murase, who previously worked on the popular Street Fighter II animated film and the Mobile Suit Gundam Wing series. The series primarily focused on only a handful of the Darkstalkers cast, namely Dimitri, Morgan, Felicia, Donovan, Shanko, and Pyron, while the rest of the characters featured up to Night Warriors made cameo appearances. While not as highly regarded as the Street Fighter II animated film, the series followed closer to the game's original story than the American cartoon and still serves as a solid foundation for future adaptations to work from. Darkstalkers received several manga adaptations in Japan throughout the 90s, with some of them being localized and released in North America. There was a 6-issue comic series written by Rune Ishida in 1996, which was released by Viz Comics in 1998, a Darkstalkers manga that featured a crossover with Capcom's Red Earth, written by Mami Ito in 1997, which was published by Udon Comics in 2010, and a 5-volume manga series based on Vampire Savior starring Lilith, created by mangaka Mayumi Azuma and published by Gungan Comics. In 2004, Udon Comics produced an original comic book series based on Darkstalkers that adapted the game's storylines and fleshed out a number of the characters' backgrounds and motivations. The series only ran for 6 issues and became notorious for ending on a cliffhanger. Fortunately, the series was picked up again in 2010 for 3 more issues, tying up more of the comic's storylines while leaving the opportunity open for more. Udon was also responsible for releasing an anniversary art book titled Darkstalkers Tribute, which consisted of artwork submitted by numerous fans of the series. After Vampire Savior was released in 1997, fans didn't hear or see much about anything new related to Darkstalkers from Capcom beyond the aforementioned adaptations. The Darkstalkers cast would make frequent appearances in a number of Capcom's crossover fighting games over the next few years, but there was never any word of a new installment in the Darkstalkers series. The birth of arcade emulation software like MAME allowed players the opportunity to play arcade-perfect versions of older fighting games like Vampire Savior. When these emulated arcade games combined with the middleware known as GGPO, players were then able to challenge others around the world through the internet and discover or establish communities for their favorite fighting games like never before. Following Capcom's return to the fighting game spotlight with Street Fighter IV, the game's producer Yoshinori Ono was frequently asked which fighting game he would like to work on next. Ono always said working on a new Darkstalkers installment was his ultimate dream, but it would first have to be seen as a viable option for Capcom, as the demand for one had to be there from the fans, as it was with Street Fighter. In the following years, Yoshinori Ono began showing a new slogan to fans, saying that Darkstalkers Are Not Dead, which appeared numerous times in promotional material for their other fighting games. In 2012, this was revealed to be part of a new campaign by a team in Capcom to bring back the series to new and old fans. To do this, the team debated which games in the Darkstalkers series would be best suited to appeal to both newcomers to the franchise and veterans in the community. Unlike Street Fighter, the Darkstalkers games have had a more conflicted history when it came to their releases, both in arcades and consoles. Darkstalkers first came to arcades in the US in 1994. Night Warriors came to arcades a year later in 1995. Darkstalkers was eventually ported to the PlayStation in 1996, but this was the same year Night Warriors was ported exclusively to the Sega Saturn, and featured an option to choose between the backgrounds and music from both Night Warriors and the original Darkstalkers. Vampire Savior came to arcades in 1997 and was ported to the Sega Saturn in 1998 with all 18 characters. It was a good arcade emulation thanks to the 4MB expansion pack, but this version was never released outside Japan due to Sega's strict software policy at the time, which prevented many of Capcom's 2D fighters on the Saturn to be released in the United States. Vampire Savior was also ported to the PlayStation in 1998 as Vampire Savior EX Edition, or Darkstalkers 3 when it was released in the US, and was actually a compilation of Vampire Savior and its 2 Japan-only arcade releases, Vampire Hunter 2 and Vampire Savior 2. However, in order to have all the characters featured in the game, many characters' attack animations were removed, resulting in choppier gameplay and an inferior arcade experience. This was a recurring issue that was seen with a lot of PlayStation ports of 2D fighting games but were absent on the Sega Saturn versions. Vampire Chronicle, the Dreamcast compilation from 2000, and Vampire Darkstalkers Collection, the PS2 compilation from 2005, were never released outside Japan, and the most recent PSP port had sold poorly due to the system's poor control interface for fighting games and early susceptibility to piracy. Rather than risk splitting the potential community with a full series compilation or choosing an iteration of the game not favored by its already dedicated players, it was decided to produce arcade ports of Night Warriors and Vampire Savior, the most popular installments among hardcore fans, in a game compilation titled Vampire Resurrection, or Darkstalkers Resurrection. It was co-developed with Iron Galaxy Studios, which had previously worked with Capcom on prior fighting game re-releases such as Street Fighter III Third Strike and Marvel vs. Capcom Origins. Darkstalkers Resurrection featured graphics filtering options, online multiplayer using GGPO, replay sharing with YouTube, character tutorials, as well as tournament and spectator modes. The compilation served as a test gauge to the interest among the fighting game community for a new Darkstalkers installment, an approach similarly done for Street Fighter with the re-release of Hyper Fighting in 2006. Along with Capcom, numerous members of the fighting game community, including some with the help of those who were already adamant Vampire Savior players on GGPO, promoted the game as best they could, featuring it at their weekly tournament cycles that were streamed online, and introducing the game to others to hopefully spark new interest in the fighting game.
But everything's going great today. There's a huge turnout for competition. There's a lot of casual setups, so anyone in the SoCal area, be sure to head to Super Arcade sometime. We're gonna try planning some events maybe in the future, hopefully.
Yeah. I'll talk about that a little later.
Okay. And among other things, as always, if you guys are interested in the game, please get Vampire Resurrection. All the pros or all the people who played before are more than happy to help out. And be sure to check out the wiki and dust loops and so on.
Yes.
However, when early sales figures were released, it was stated by Capcom that the game hadn't sold enough to greenlight a brand new installment. According to a release statement by Capcom USA Senior Vice President Christian Svensson, the early numbers of consumers who had downloaded and played Darkstalkers Resurrection were nowhere near the number of people who had requested a re-release. The team at Capcom were grateful to those who supported the Darkstalkers initiative and purchased the game, and they would continue to promote the game through its community in the hopes of garnering more potential players. Over the next few months, Darkstalkers Resurrection was continually promoted by Capcom, making more appearances at tournaments for the Darkstalkers community and providing more updates to the game. But as time went on, the sales for Darkstalkers Resurrection continued to see a decline, and the majority of Vampire Savior players reverted back to playing the game on GGPO, as Darkstalkers Resurrection was moved out of the spotlight to make way for newer fighting games.
Interesting. This is really good stuff right now.
Yeah. I just wish it was longer though.
I know. But, you know, I mean, the point of this was so people could see amazing action. Oh, let me read off a code.
By 2013, Capcom's fighting game manager Matt Dahlgren stated that due to the continued sales of Darkstalkers Resurrection remaining sluggish, the viability for Capcom to produce a whole new Darkstalkers game seemed less likely, and the team's focus would return to Street Fighter. The discussion among fans and players for a new Darkstalkers game is one that has continued to get brought up over the years. When Street Fighter and Marvel vs. Capcom returned with new installments after a long hiatus, Darkstalkers is one of the brand names that most fans want to throw up next when it came to another consideration. After all, with Capcom having such success with Street Fighter 4 and Marvel vs. Capcom 3, it's natural that longtime fans would want to see more of their favorite Capcom fighting games make a return with an updated design, whether it be Darkstalkers, Street Fighter Alpha, Capcom vs. SNK, or even rival schools. The demand for a new game is generally seen by this audience as an expectancy, but to better understand the fate of a series like Darkstalkers, there are at least 3 different factors that should be considered by looking at Capcom's other once dormant fighting game series, Street Fighter. The first factor is the fighting game community, namely those dedicated players who've continued to play fighting games long after their release, breaking them down and learning their intricacies. 2 of the biggest competitive communities are those that play Street Fighter and Marvel vs. Capcom. A game like Street Fighter has become one of the most well-known video games because it's had a presence throughout many players' lives, whether it be in the original arcades or one of its numerous ports to consoles. Practically anyone playing video games over the past couple decades could have accessed or encountered some version of Street Fighter. It's a well-known franchise in the industry and one of Capcom's top sellers, resulting in one of the most dedicated fan bases.
What other games do I have? I don't even know I have a lot of games.
Unfortunately, this is not the case with Darkstalkers, as it was only considered popular among players in Japan during its initial arcade releases, which may have been what led to a number of its arcade and console iterations remaining exclusive to the country. Those that continue to play fighting games like Street Fighter have many different reasons for being part of that community, whether it be for the shared passion of their fellow enthusiasts, the chance pursuit of a potential career playing the fighting games they love, the pride of their local community and country, or simply the nature of competition for them that can't be attained elsewhere. Like any popular video game revolving around competition, the best players would rise to the top, garner respect among their peers, and attain a sort of pseudo-celebrity status inside the community. Eventually, people would not just become attracted to a popular fighting game, but also to the fans that surround it, viewing notable players as underdogs, people's champions, or even villains, creating rivalries between top players, personalities, and regional communities. Over the years, the Street Fighter and Marvel vs. Capcom communities have managed and succeeded to reach beyond its customary bounds and into the video game mainstream media through word of mouth and viral videos. When Capcom took a long hiatus from developing another Street Fighter game in the early 2000s, it was a period often referred to as the Dark Age of fighting games, as though there were no other compelling options for players when it came to new fighting games. That belief technically wasn't true, as a number of compelling fighting games were made by other companies during this time, and Capcom still continued to produce new fighting games too, but this whole perception represented the magnitude of the void felt by a large and passionate community, as well as possibly their indifference. For longtime fighting game fans, Street Fighter II was their first attraction to the genre. Over time, they've mostly gravitated together between each new series, before primarily settling into two similar but different competitive communities. Street Fighter III Third Strike, a fighting game with deep mechanics that remains well regarded to this day, and Marvel vs. Capcom 2, a fighting game that had a very dedicated following in North America. Long after either of these games were released, their passion allowed them to remain a presence in the video game zeitgeist, and it played a key role into their eventual returns, thanks to advocates like David Sirlin and Seth Killian. So when Street Fighter 4 and Marvel vs. Capcom 3 were released, they were clearly seen by these competitive communities as the next big focus. The argument over which of Capcom's fighting games is truly the best is one of those debates that is always argued and never settled, but the truth of the matter is these were seen as the games to replace the predecessors for their respective communities. The overall popularity of any fighting game comes down to a matter of brand recognition and the present community size. Nowadays, a fighting game would have to be built on a long-running or well-known beloved franchise in order to reach anything close to mass appeal in the video game industry. If a new or relatively smaller fighting game community wanted to get the attention of the bigger communities, they would have to have a large enough number of people playing their game exclusively that they can't seemingly go unnoticed forever. Having said that, it feels like that should be the case with the Darkstalkers games, since they were also developed in the same time period as Street Fighter. But as a result of being from Capcom, Darkstalkers also suffered the perpetual challenge of struggling to stand out against the company's other fighting games and its big competitors that had a larger presence at the time. Plus, it didn't help that the characters from the Darkstalkers series didn't have the same appeal and familiarity as Street Fighter or Marvel Comics. To this day, it still faces that challenge of finding a dedicated audience of players large enough to stand alongside the other big fighting games from Capcom or otherwise. For instance, Capcom has released a number of new and old fighting games alongside Street Fighter 4 and Marvel vs. Capcom 3. While each of these games have their share of fans and even started their own dedicated communities, the number of players who are still actively playing them pale in comparison to the numbers of Street Fighter 4 or Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3. So those players have to work harder to make their presence known, or else their games of choice would just be seen as a passing curiosity and likely never to be heard from again. Players can appreciate fighting games of all types, but fighting game communities are notorious for their unsympathetic nature when it comes to acknowledging the newer or smaller ones, because at the end of the day, these communities are playing and supporting the games they favor and are not responsible for the welfare of the others. But as the fighting game community's reach has grown larger thanks to online multiplayer and social media, it's also become necessary to be more open to new fighting games and their own dedicated audiences to sustain that growth. For example, those who organize events for fighting games and want them to grow must also choose which of these games should be given a presence at their local gatherings and tournaments based on their present community size. Even if top players pushed for less popular fighting games, no tournaments would want to host them if there is a low player turnout, and even those that play fighting games as their profession have no reason to invest their time into supporting too many of them if there's little to no financial gain from it for them. The second factor is the video game companies that continue to make fighting games. When Street Fighter II became a huge success for Capcom, it sparked a newfound interest in fighting games on a global scale. Naturally, Capcom seized the opportunity and rapidly increased their fighting game output on a yearly basis. This rising popularity of fighting games was also seen by other big Japanese companies at the time, which also produced a number of new fighting game series of their own. This was likely the only way Capcom was able to produce another fighting game series like X-Men and Darkstalkers. In order to produce so many new fighting games on a regular basis, these companies would have to reuse various game assets or slightly alter them in order to make enough new content for each of their new iterations and installments. For many of these developers, home consoles didn't even enter their minds. When they created games, it was for the arcade centers and they were the final destination or goal. Because of that, there were so many different versions of the same title. This ability to have so many frequent updates allowed developers to continue balancing and iterating on their fighting games, adding a new layer of mechanics with each new game. Some of Capcom's most popular fighting games could be seen as a direct result of these circumstances. Marvel vs. Capcom 2, with its large roster of characters, culminated from years of collaborations with Marvel Comics. Capcom vs. SNK 2, with its large roster and game mechanics representing two companies at the peak of their fighting game popularity. King of Fighters and Street Fighter were getting annual installments and updates. Companies like Capcom, Sega, Square, and Namco also invested heavily into the genre by becoming the early pioneers of 3D polygonal fighting games. With so much rapid fighting game output, their influence and presence managed to spread into other mediums and genres besides fighting games. Even though most of those endeavors are seen as duds today, it still left an impression on their fans, and their pursuits by companies demonstrate just how lucrative fighting game brands were to video game companies at the time. But as time went on, the interest in new fighting games began to decline, and companies that once thrived on this particular genre began to see diminishing returns on new franchises. Perhaps it had to do with the decline of the arcade scene in the United States, the rise of home consoles and the popularity of new genres, or the fact that new players simply didn't want to learn another fighting game with even more complicated mechanics. There will always be players who can appreciate a good fighting game, but a large majority of them are drawn more to the spectacle than the underlying gameplay mechanics. The original SNK went into bankruptcy, and Sega exited the console hardware business in 2001, while other Japanese companies would eventually merge together to become new business entities. Meanwhile, Capcom moved away from developing many video games for the arcade centers, effectively shutting down their fighting game department, and began to focus on developing video games designed for home consoles and other markets.
昨日の朝だよ。川向こうの公園でジミたちとクリケットやってたらお前のママが通りかかってでお前が帰ってくるかもしれないからそれまでに戻らなかったらそれを渡してくれって。
With this transition, Capcom started becoming known less as a fighting game company and more as a video game company that also produced fighting games. Capcom still continued to release fighting games, but the majority of their development would be outsourced to other companies. In order for Capcom and other companies like them to maintain sustainability, fighting games became a smaller piece in a larger portfolio of video games. Despite Capcom's shift in focus, former rival companies still continued to produce more of their famous fighting games, while newer companies came in with their own takes on the fighting game formula. However, those that were seen as just pumping out sequels eventually led to diminishing returns. It got to a point where new big-budget fighting games whose selling factors were simply based on gimmicks and shock factor alone wouldn't work anymore.
The first question we always get is how are the Wii's unique controls integrated into Armageddon? The Wii Remote and Nunchuck controller are used together, giving you total control of your character. The traditional joypad and button combinations have been replaced with simple swing motions on the Wii Remote, making them easier to perform than ever before.
Hey! もうちょい！いけてる！超やばいよ！
Other Japanese companies came into the market with their own original fighting games and proved that fighting games that used classic 2D character sprites could still be engaging enough to establish its own dedicated community. However, many of them struggled to have much success beyond their devoted niche audiences due to their low brand awareness and recognition outside that audience. These fighting games have such a small audience that they are often typecast by other fighting game communities as a subgenre within fighting games. Nowadays, the ability and tools to create a whole new fighting game have become more accessible than ever before. With smaller production teams and budgets, it's easier for a new fighting game to find success and make a profit, not through sales numbers, but the help of a small, dedicated audience thanks to options like crowdsourcing and contracting to ensure a small, independent development company's sustainability. Many of these smaller companies are primarily known for producing their respective fighting games as their sole focus, whereas the older Japanese companies, who were once pioneers of the fighting game genre, persevere by producing, developing, and publishing a breadth of video games spanning all genres and platforms. Even Street Fighter, despite being one of Capcom's oldest and highest-selling franchises, went through a series of hurdles within the company before getting a new installment greenlit into production. Fortunately, it still had that large existing community that would support the series, proving a new game's marketability and people who could effectively contribute to its production. Since fighting games now only make up a small piece of these companies' large portfolios, more would be gained by investing into the more familiar brands like Street Fighter than an original or long-dormant franchise like Darkstalkers, thanks to having a large and active installed fan base. No longer as lucrative as they once were, Most business pursuits for fighting game brands, outside of the fighting games themselves, have become much smaller productions and therefore have less risk attached to them. Instead of focusing solely on releasing packaged retail games or games designed for arcade centers like before, many companies have begun experimenting with video games designed around a free-to-play model and microtransactions, or creating games exclusively tailored to new markets and audiences that tend to favor playing games through platforms like web browsers or mobile phones. It's an issue many video game companies continue to face, where they focus on developing more familiar games with a greater chance of success while investing less in new original games with more financial risk. That's why it's become more difficult for Capcom, or any other company for that matter, to create a new original fighting game using the old arcade iteration model that could duplicate the sales or lasting effect of a series like Street Fighter or Marvel vs. Capcom. It would need to do something neither of them have done before, or couldn't be done by them, in order to come close to matching their successes. New fighting games can still sell well or get good reviews when they release, especially if it's an older established brand, but public interest can always eventually dwindle. With a growing majority of the video game audience around the world, outside of Japan, already adverse to new and original fighting games, they won't get far on mechanics alone and would have to be something truly stellar in order to make any sort of waves at all. Otherwise, they'll just fall to the wayside, only to be played by the small minority of players who were long made aware of them and choose to remain dedicated to them. The third factor is one that is often disregarded by most players, but is perhaps the most important of all. It's something that goes beyond simply a video game's sales potential or the interest of the fighting game community. It's the matter of inheritance. Nowadays, many popular video games are not just seen as associated with a company, but rather a single designer or team within that company, often as the figurehead of the franchise, and it's no different when it comes to fighting games. For example, the fighting game series Guilty Gear by Arc System Works is well known among its fans as being created by Daisuke Ishiwatari, who was responsible for designing the game's characters, storyline, and composing the music. He's worked on other games with his development team at Arc System Works, but when it comes to Guilty Gear, his inspirations and influences can still be seen throughout the entire game's design to this day. Other examples include BlazBlue, while also made at Arc System Works, has Toshimichi Mori, Mortal Kombat has Ed Boon, Skullgirls had Mike Zamont and Alex Ahad, Nintendo's Super Smash Bros. Has Masahiro Sakurai, Namco's Tekken has Katsuhiro Harada, Tecmo's Dead or Alive had Team Ninja with Tobunobu Itagaki and now Yosuke Hayashi. Many of these people have been with their respective franchises since their early inception, and while some of them have changed positions or had their development teams change over the years, they are still associated with these games to a degree where they hold a strong influence over where their series goes moving forward. For many of these game developers, working on another game in a long-running series becomes not just a tradition, but an inevitability.
Is there going to be a Mortal Kombat 4, and will you ever draw the line where you say it's too violent?
Yeah, there's of course we're going to draw the line.
Okay.
Certainly, yeah.
Okay, this is the 10th Mortal Kombat.
Yeah, unbelievable.
How do you pronounce the name of the new game?
The official title is X, Mortal Kombat X.
Okay.
But, X means also Roman numeral 10. We refer to it internally as 10 until it was announced, and then it became X.
Now it's X. Yeah. Okay, all right. And thanks for spending some time with us. All right, we'll see you.
When it comes to Street Fighter, one of the biggest misconceptions players have is that there was also a single team or figurehead at Capcom responsible for producing all of the games since the beginning, but that couldn't be further from the truth. The teams responsible for each iteration and installment of Street Fighter have contained different groups of producers, artists, animators, and programmers led by a different main designer whose influences and inspirations have come from very different sources. The distinctions between all the different series of Street Fighter games have become much clearer over the years among its fans, resulting in varying preferences over iterations and installments. Every video game made at Capcom or any other company has had their own development team with members of varying levels of experience. The more seasoned veterans would teach and train the younger, less experienced members on the team, some of whom would go on to inherit their roles on a future project. Over the years, designers who started working on a single department for one video game could potentially become the directors or producers of another game until they either choose to depart from the company or are promoted to a higher executive position where they would oversee a number of projects at once, all the while paving the way for newer, younger members to take up the positions they left behind. It's often been reported that a number of Capcom's designers departed the company following the decision to shut down its fighting game department. But while the more high-profile producers behind many of Capcom's fighting games left to start their own companies like those before them, a number of the lesser-known designers who had worked under them would remain at the company to work on new and original projects until they would inherit their own development team. Those designers who chose to move into freelance work are able to use their experience to contribute their talents to more companies, including Capcom should they choose to rehire them for a new project. Each of these teams brought with them their own experiences and visions to their respective projects. During their time, they received all types of criticism internally from within the team and externally from longtime fans over every aspect of their version of a game, whether it be new characters in Street Fighter who were believed to be incapable of having the same timeless designs of prior rosters, or new features and mechanics many felt were not befitting of an established series. All the while unaware that the teams working on them internally at Capcom were different from the ones that came before them. This has arguably been one of the hardest challenges for a new Darkstalkers game to become a reality. Much of the development team responsible for the original games have either departed from Capcom a long time ago or moved on to work on other projects. Due to the cryptic nature of Japanese game development back then and the lack of public information available, it's difficult for anyone to really know everyone who was part of the original development team or considered the figurehead of a given franchise. Theoretically, a new development team could be built up within Capcom to work on a new Darkstalkers game. Another company could also be contracted or outsourced to do the same job. These questions of who would or wouldn't be a worthy candidate to take up such a position are the kinds of discussions that hardcore fans love to often theorize about. But they tend to forget how controversial these kinds of decisions can be. Plus, these new teams would face the same difficult challenges and pressures faced by the new teams responsible for creating a new Street Fighter or Marvel vs. Capcom. Like many of the previous designers who worked on Street Fighter 4 and Marvel vs. Capcom 3, they would have no senior members of the original teams to turn to for advice. The unique perspective that the original producers could have contributed is now gone. A majority of those people have moved on, taking with them their influences, direction, and vision. But it's not just the matter of inheriting the work of a prior team they would have to overcome. There's also the matter of inheriting all of the expectations and baggage that's been built up by the series' longtime fans, the vocal minority who crave for something new while also wanting more of the same. This new team would have to create characters and mechanics that fill a new vision in fighting game design, but the influences that they would draw from is completely different than what it was with the old team from those many years ago. Creating a new Darkstalkers game would be a difficult task for the development team who have to struggle to appeal to a large audience who will play the latest Street Fighter but cares little for a new Darkstalkers, as well as the much smaller audience who continue to play Vampire Savior and are knowledgeable on everything when it comes to Darkstalkers. The harshest critics could easily point to this new team's prior experience with fighting games, or lack thereof, as evidence that they would be incapable of meeting the franchise's standards and accuse them of being more likely to tarnish its legacy outright. Viewing its development from the outside, most dedicated fans would argue over everything the team should be doing rather than what they are attempting, and if it doesn't live up to all of their expectations for one reason or another, this development team would forever be seen as the scapegoat in the event of the franchise's demise following its release. Either way, the new team would be in a damned if they do, damned if they don't situation. Capcom took a chance when it decided to return to fighting games after a long hiatus, and the gamble paid off for them. With Street Fighter 4, the company was praised for revitalizing the fighting game genre, but its success has brought forth new realities they have to face moving forward. Since they had shut down their fighting game department so many years ago, there's been a long period of time when fighting games were not being developed internally at Capcom. Any new fighting games they choose to produce has to be worked on with the assistance of an outside developer. Despite these developers' varied experiences when it came to producing fighting games, they managed to design new games to satisfy a large but selective audience, but their experience remains not as consistent or extensive as their more seasoned contemporaries. Yoshinori Ono is well regarded as being instrumental in bringing back Street Fighter and is now seen by fans as the figurehead for all of Capcom's future fighting games. But the truth is, his own history working on fighting games was very limited as well, having worked on a number of different video games at Capcom. He has since been promoted to a corporate position where he continues to oversee a number of different video games produced by Capcom. While still a supporter of more new fighting games at the company, he has also had fellow designers appointed to his former position who continue his work updating past fighting games with new iterations, taking feedback from fans, and promoting Capcom's fighting game presence in the industry. Taking all of these different factors into consideration, it seems like the future of the Darkstalkers franchise appears very grim. If it ever hopes to make a return like Street Fighter before it, it would have to garner enough public attention and support outside its small dedicated fanbase to acquire the mindshare of the larger fighting game communities and prove to be a worthwhile endeavor for Capcom. These are very difficult challenges that can't easily be dealt with due to Darkstalkers always being a relatively obscure franchise. It's also been a concern for longtime fans whether or not Darkstalkers could even make the transition into a modern design successfully, given the series' inclination toward the bizarre and unorthodox. The original games had a rare balance between being violent while also very tongue-in-cheek thematically. To many people familiar with Darkstalkers by name only, it could be perceived that Darkstalkers was just another video game series only capable of existing and thriving during its time when the fighting games were considered a booming market. In a way, Darkstalkers was a series that managed to exist because of Street Fighter. However, it can also be argued that Street Fighter was a series that managed to grow and evolve because of Darkstalkers. Since the Darkstalkers games were originally being developed during the same time period as Capcom's Street Fighter and X-Men fighting games, they also shared a lot of the same designers between each other. When a new mechanic or feature was first introduced and experimented with by the development team in one fighting game, it would often be iterated or refined upon and later reappear in another. Many of these early fighting game innovations from Capcom could also be traced back to the original Darkstalkers games. For example, when Darkstalkers first introduced the guard cancel, it was a mechanic that would later be seen in the Street Fighter Alpha series but referred to as Alpha counters. The same could be seen with a number of the series' other features like the chain combo system, air blocking, and enhanced special moves. The Darkstalkers' influence would go beyond the Street Fighter series and become expanded upon even further in the Versus series. By the time Marvel vs. Capcom enabled the possibility of including characters from the Darkstalkers series, it became more than just a simple matter of fan service, but also proof of how these characters and their mechanics could easily transition into this crossover fighting game series so smoothly. Countless other influences can be traced to Capcom's other fighting games during that time, and characters from Darkstalkers would always make an appearance in every crossover opportunity. When Capcom returned to the fighting game spotlight with its new development teams in the late 2000s, a number of their new fighting games could still be seen as placing a strong emphasis on many of the same mechanics that once served as the foundation for Darkstalkers. One of the core design philosophies of the original Darkstalkers team was to make a game that was very different from Street Fighter, as seen with its mechanics and character roster. The designers' bold choice to take an approach so contrary to what many other game companies were vying to imitate at the time enabled them to not just strive for something unusual, but take it to an extreme unlike anything anyone had seen before. While Darkstalkers was probably not the first fighting game to not feature a cast of characters based around martial artists like Street Fighter, the developers' aspiration for the unconventional was taken to its extreme, resulting in characters that appeared eccentric, uncanny, and lively, with unrivaled sprite animations pushing the limits to create some uniquely cartoonish and vibrant imagery. Because of this, Darkstalkers has remained enduring for many players not just for its well-established game mechanics, but also because it's simply just an amazing game to watch in action. The series' unique approach to character designs were so inspired that it can still be seen throughout other fighting games that have been produced over the years. Darkstalkers as a fighting game will probably never manage to reach the popularity or success of Street Fighter or its many contemporaries, but seeing and understanding the amount of influence it has had over the years on so many video games, Darkstalkers also shouldn't be a series that remains largely unknown to anyone who can appreciate a great fighting game. Vampire Savior is still praised by the hardcore fighting game community for its depth, speed, and mechanics, and there are even regular gatherings and tournaments in Japan dedicated to Vampire Savior and Night Warriors. The opportunity for the series to grow in brand awareness and popularity has also become more facilitated compared to when it was originally released, thanks to its community of dedicated players who have been introduced to the series over the years and continue to play together either locally or online with GGPO, as well as Capcom choosing to make Darkstalkers an ongoing presence in their large portfolio of video games. Whether or not Darkstalkers will ever return in the form of a new fighting game installment is never a sure thing given the current environment of fighting games in the video game industry. As is the case with any franchise that has remained dormant for a long time, its so-called return can be considered inevitable by its die-hard fans, but not something that can always be determined or predicted accurately. The difference with these types of video games is that the chances of their return and success are approached by a company on a case-by-case basis. When people cannot easily perceive when such a thing will become a reality, they are more inclined to simply see its prospects as being dead, confirming self-fulfilling preconceptions. And yet, the spirit of Darkstalkers and what it represented could still be found throughout, whether it be among its dedicated community of players around the world, or its constant influence and presence in video games from Capcom or otherwise, both literally and intrinsically. In a way, it could also be seen that Darkstalkers, not just as a game but as a brand and design philosophy, has never truly shown signs of being dead, and it never will.
これだけしけてるわね。
Let's play. まだまだ切り足りぬ。I'm Bad Master。これが定めか。違う、猫パン。